Recently, I was planning my schedule for future videos, and particularly I was looking at post emergency disaster at various time milestones, whether it be 3 days, 3 weeks, 90 days, a year, or 3 years. There are disasters that would be long term. The Great American Depression lasted 10 years, and it's estimated if there was a thermonuclear exchange, it could take decades for the reconstitution of civilization. So, as I've thought about that, it occurred to me at some point your food storage would be exhausted. And what do you do with it at that point? Well, it may seem a little humorous, but I came to the conclusion you had to become like my grandmother. Now, you might say, don't you have two grandmothers? Well, I do, and it doesn't matter which one of the two you choose. One was of Irish descent and lived in southern Utah, and the other one was my maternal mother. Grandmother was a woman of the South, originally a Baptist and then a Methodist, and she had a little orange grove down in Florida. And it really wouldn't matter which you chose. They both had raised their families in the midst of the Great American Depression of the 1930s. I didn't think that would make a very good title for a video, to prevail, to survive and thrive from a emergency disaster. You need to become like my grandmother. It just doesn't have much sizzle to it. So I've entitled this When Homesteading Meets Preparedness for Long-Term Disasters. So what do I mean by this? Well, people who are into emergency preparedness are more event-driven as a general statement. In other words, the hurricane, the tornado, the financial collapse, the pandemic, a war, where I think a definition of homesteading would be it's more of a lifestyle. It's self-sufficiency. It's an ongoing set of activities. And those activities can be pretty significant. The homesteading activities can be quite varied, but they usually involve at the minimum having a garden, having a greenhouse, perhaps raising chickens. Now beyond that, you could raise a pig, you could have a cow, you could get into beekeeping, which my father did that as a hobby. It's just a fascinating one, and it's very intriguing what is happening to the bee population on the earth now. It's very difficult for them to survive in the wild. Also, fishing and crabbing, and as I mentioned, my grandmother had an orange grove. Another key thing is when you have a harvest of your fruit and even meats for that matter that you've raised, you have to know how to preserve that long term. So canning and pickling. Another activity would be sewing. So all of these are very advantageous to a disaster preparedness minded person when the food stores run out. Now, you actually have to have some lead time. In other words, as your emergency preparedness food stocks deplenish, you need to be ramping up on, in fact, the home self-sufficiency that you would obtain from your homesteading skills. Now, also, a homesteader, you may have an adverse year of weather or infestation of bugs that aren't kind to your garden. So likewise, you as a homesteader could borrow some of the practices and habits of disaster preparedness minded people. Now, some helpful resources would be some of the homesteading videos which I examined. One just excellent one is Loving Off the Land, and that's spelled Lovin, one word, Loving Off the Land. And a young couple did a very interesting experience. They chose to and documented this with their YouTube channel, A Year Living Off the Land. And they lived for 1 year where what they ate was what they raised, what they could catch, and crabbing and fishing that they could do. They are located on Pender Island, which is in lower British Columbia. Another great website was Oak, that's OAK, Abode, Oak Abode. And she does a great job, particularly in one of her videos, of 11 Great Depression era habits coming back in style, frugal skills for economics. So I would highly recommend watching at least those two videos. And then just two quick other resources would be More Than Farmers and Morgan Hill. Now, I think it would be a fair question to ask, just exactly what did your grandmothers do? What were the practices that they utilized in the 1930s? Well, my mother was the last of 9 children, plus the mother and father, so a family of 11 people in southern Utah. And my mother said my maternal grandmother was a very industrious person. She was of Irish descent, and she would always have a garden large enough to feed the entire family of 11 people. Also, she had a very large amount of chickens that she raised, and she said having eggs was always plentiful, that they had chicken for dinner or lunch 2 or 3 times a week. She said when she started the 7th grade, her mother pulled her aside and said, well, the next 2 years you need to help me with the sewing because you need to know how to become a very good seamstress. And they made all the clothing for the girls. They made the shirts for the boys in the family. And my maternal grandmother was willing to buy pants, factory-made pants for the men in the family. She said that the corduroy pants and the Levi pants of the day were quite rugged, and she just didn't have the equipment to produce something that durable. But after a couple years of my mother being her understudy for sewing, as she entered 9th grade, her mother explained to her, well, in high school, you need to work with your older sisters and learn how to cook. And originally her mother had taught the oldest daughters how to cook, and they always did the cooking. And so, and also they would harvest from the garden and spend, my mother said, sometimes weeks doing canning and preserving. Now, also I should mention that she said that her father actually had one of the best paying jobs in town. He worked for the railroad. So they did have a house that they owned. They had a car that they owned. And but with a large family like that, they didn't have a lot of the luxuries that we would think of today. As a matter of fact, my maternal grandmother explained to her, it's very important that you get a very good high school education because that will probably be the end of your education, and it's imperative that you be able to be literate enough to teach your own children how to read and write, to help your husband with finances. And my mother was always a straight A student throughout high school. So that's how this southern Utah grandmother kept everything rolling with a family of 11. Now, my father's situation was a bit different. For much of his childhood, my paternal grandmother was a single parent. Her father had helped her buy a small orange grove, and they did have a garden that they raised. During World War II, she raised chickens, but after the World War II, she got rid of them. My dad said she said that they were just too messy. Now, my father also would talk about once he was about 8 years old, when he got home from school, that if he wanted some protein, that meant he needed to get him a hunting rifle or a fishing rod and go catch something in Florida. Well, fortunately at that time there was plenty of wildlife and fishes. And he was graduated from high school. The last year of high school, he would go down to Tampa, the Tampa shipyard, and was a welder on Liberty ships. But he did get drafted into the war and was in combat with the 3rd Infantry Divisions. So a rugged group of people from the 1930s. And we may just have to go back to all of that. Now, if you found this video helpful, please click like and subscribe. It helps the channel and it helps the community. Be prepared.